everyone, welcome back to another episode of Uplift. Joining me this week is Mattea Merta, who's a Global Policy Advisor to the United Nations, and she's also the co-host of Let's Check the News. Hi Mattea, great to have you here with me in the studio. Thank you for joining me for Uplift. So very often we hear that Western nations are pouring out funding into African nations for abortion provisions, which ultimately reject African values such as protecting life and rejecting abortion. Mattea, from your time at the UN, have you any experience of Western nations putting pressure on African nations to legalise abortion?
Oh, every single year, without fault, we see Western nations funding and promoting and pressuring African nations to legalize and or liberalize abortion in their nations. And we have to understand that the UN system, especially within the UN system, that it's basically a money funnel into African nations for Western nations. It's kind of like the guise that all these Western nations hide behind, because if you were to, as a wealthy Western donor nation to an African nation, you were just to say, okay, we want to liberalize abortion in Kenya or Nigeria or Nairobi. That would look very much like a colonialistic kind of ideology, or what we call it is ideological colonialism. And so it would look very colonialistic at that point. So they don't necessarily do that anymore so directly. What Western nations do is they'll push it through funding, that is through the United Nations, to then put pressure upon African nations, because the UN holds this clout or this credibility. For some reason, they're an unelected body of individuals that end up pressuring for a globalist means of system. But we also see Western nations utilizing philanthropists and or different groups, local groups on the ground. They'll fund various, whether they create these groups or these groups are created organically. They will say Canada, for example, has funded various organizations that somehow just magically sprung up in the last couple of years, who are very pro-abortion, very anti-woman and anti-family. And Canada went, oh, there's a group and we're going to fund them instead of funding the Ministry of Health or solely just going through the UN system. So it's very normal to see Western nations pushing through the UN system for abortion.
That's horrible. In Western nations, there seems to be a growing anti-family sentiments, which view large families as negative. And you can hear people routinely say that large families are causing, climate crisis. What do you think when you hear this, these sort of claims?
Oh my goodness. It's so detached from science. If you look at the totality of what science is actually telling us, human beings are actually beneficial to the planet, beneficial to all aspects of the planet. So I would encourage people to actually look at the research being conducted. It's a blatant anti-family, pro-abortion rhetoric, in my view. And it's funny because I see all the same people pushing the same narratives, whether it's there's too many people on the planet, or we need to legalize abortion, or these anti-family pro LGBTQ2IA alphabet soup kind of agendas. It's all these things being pushed by the same people. So I immediately have to, there's no coincidences. Once you see this thread being strung by the same people and the same talking points being spread, I just point them back to the research, and that immediately destabilizes their entire agenda.
So Mattea, as you are a native of Canada, can you share with us a little bit of insight into what it's like being a pro-lifer in Canada?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. It's not a question that I get asked often, but I appreciate it. To be a pro-lifer in Canada is to face constant discrimination, not just from your fellow citizens, but also from various levels of government and institutions. And it's interesting, and when I say your fellow citizens, I would say primarily that occurs when you're farther out east or west, on either side of Canada. When you're in the middle of Canada, where I originally come from, I come from Saskatchewan, which we are like the salt of the earth kind of people, very down to earth. And we really value life. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, very pro-life provinces. But when you hit the more eastern and western sides of Canada, the bigger centers tend to be incredibly hostile. And I had a friend, actually, I work with my UN work, I actually do it through a Canadian organization still. And a dear friend who used to have actually my job, she was assaulted on the streets. It became a viral video. Marie Claire Bazinet was her name. And she was actually assaulted on the streets. And we've seen this constant hostility, even to having life chains. So like as simple as holding a placard outside of a hospital has become deemed as violence, or speaking out on social media has been deemed as hateful speech, solely for speaking up for the most vulnerable. So it is constant discrimination and just people being blatantly rude, to be honest. But for me, someone like me, I love to stir the pot, and that fuels my fire. So anytime someone pushes back against me, I'm like, bring it on. You just make me want to be more bold. And I hope that a lot of people, through what I say or what I speak, I hope people take that as a badge of honor when they face opposition to anything that they speak out against when it's righteous, that it's actually proof that you are indeed taking ground and to keep going.
And are you anyway optimistic that a culture of life can be restored in Canada?
I'm always optimistic. It is very difficult under the Trudeau administration, however, to see that going forward. He has banned anyone who is pro-life from his cabinet. He's banned anyone who's pro-life from his party. We see the same thing with various other political parties in Canada, that you cannot be pro-life. And even the Conservative Party, which I used to work with a member of parliament, he used to be a conservative, and even seeing that party, it's been very bizarre to witness this shrinking and this intolerance towards individuals who are pro-life from even running for the Conservative Party. So it has to be from the bottom up. It can't be from the top down. And within Canadian culture, it's so often that we look to politicians to be the spearheads of movements, but the movement for life has to be with the people. And I've slowly seen, there's recent data that came out that the majority of young individuals in Canada are indeed pro-life, or would like to see some sort of limitation on abortion. So that was incredibly encouraging, because there is no law in Canada whatsoever regarding abortion. You can have it at any point in time for any reason. And this is for any Canadian individual. So I could see a slow implementation of pro-life laws, but again, we have bubble zones. I think there was recently something that happened, a couple instances with, I believe it was a PSPO in the UK. We have the similar situations happening in Canada all the time, so much so that they're not really even reported upon anymore. So I have optimism, and I think it'll be very telling the next 5 to 10 years what happens in Canada with the pro-life movement.
So in the UK at the moment, Canada has being in the headlines as well here because of the stories that are happening with euthanasia. Can you tell us what it's like in Canada at the moment? How is euthanasia playing out, and how the people of Canada feel generally about euthanasia?
Right. So it is a very disturbing trend. When I worked in the government of Canada about, oh gosh, it was just a couple of years ago now, I was stakeholder relations, so I was meeting with lobbyists all the time. And the main lobbyist that the meeting wrenched my heart out. It was all about the incoming euthanasia and assisted suicide laws being proposed by Justin Trudeau. And what impacted me so deeply is this individual, he was talking about it, and he said what took the Netherlands and what took European nations 50 plus years to achieve and reach in terms of legislation around assisted suicide and euthanasia is taking less than 4 years, 6 years for Justin Trudeau to usher in. And it was so impactful that I left that meeting and I was in tears, because I knew where this was going. It wasn't just going to be for the elderly or those who were in the most in the toughest stages of development of disease, it was going to end up being for children. And that stems right back to a lack of respect for human dignity at the most vulnerable stages in Canada. So you can see this correlation between a lack of respect for dignity for the most vulnerable, the preborn, but then you also see it for not just those who are suffering and those who are elderly, but then you see these assisted suicide, euthanasia laws being expanded to those who have depression and children as young as 12, 14 years of age. And there's about 10,000 people, I believe the data just showed, of individuals who have lost their lives to euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada. And that was deeply impactful. I heard the first story that really came out that impacted Canadians the most, and there was moral outcry from individuals who supported both euthanasia and assisted suicide, and those who were adamantly against it. And that was the story of a veteran, a military veteran, who couldn't climb the stairs anymore and asked for a stair lift. And on the phone with Veterans Affairs, she was told that, hey, have you considered assisted suicide? And it was just so, and they said the government blew it off as this one-time thing that happened. But it's never just a one-time thing. Again, look for the consistency and you will see. So this happened again and again and again. And it was so devastating. That impacted my heart. I know veterans. I have a large group of friends who are veterans in Canada, United States, around the world. And to see this law that deems their lives not valuable after sacrificing all that they have. But again, it all stems back of respect for human dignity. And I believe that started when we rid our country of our abortion laws.
It's absolutely horrifying hearing that happening to veterans, to anyone.
Anyone.
Yeah, exactly. As someone who is active in politics and you're firm in your Christian faith, what would you say to Christian leaders who refuse to preach or have sermons on life issues for fear of offending their people?
You know, there's this saying, what would Jesus do? And Jesus offended all the time. And if we bear his name, if we are truly Christians, what are you doing? By many preachers today even are prostituting out their pulpits to the pro-abortion agenda, to anti-family agendas. What are you doing? That you will be held accountable unto God for eternity for what you do here on earth. So I would keep it simply and plainly as that. You will be held accountable, and you are either leading your people towards heaven or you're leading them towards hell at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a simple yet a strong message as well. And Mattea, what would you say to young people here in the UK who are pro-life, who are afraid to vocalise their views, whether it's in person or online? What would you say to them?
Never be afraid, because you're on the right side of history. You're standing for human rights. You are standing for the most vulnerable. It's never an extreme position to take to say that you are indeed pro-life, because what does that make the other side then? It makes the other side pro-death, pro-murder, pro-abortion. Never be ashamed for taking a stand. I can tell you truthfully that when I started taking strong stances on the family against abortion, in favor of traditional values within the political sphere, online, in my personal conversations, it's like it broke this barrier and the floodgates opened of opportunity. And not just opportunity, but for political purposes, but also for personal purposes. I saw so many individuals start to shift their worldviews based upon my strong stance. And I have a sphere of influence that you don't have, and that you have one that I don't have. So who is going to reach those people? Only you can, with the truth. And in a world where truth is deemed as hateful or intolerant, we need to speak it even more so. So if many people, young people, are looking to be leaders, to be influencers, but for what good is it, like the word of God says, to gain the whole world, but lose your soul? what good is it to have 1 million followers yet leading them towards what? Towards the next popular outfit, which is not horrible in and of itself, but how much more so could you be influencing policy in your nation to save the most vulnerable? So influence is not a bad thing. Influence is a good thing. And we've each been given a sphere of influence to speak into. It's your job to steward that well. And that's what I would say to young pro-lifers in the UK.
Indeed, that's a fantastic, encouraging message for our young people. I'm sure they appreciate that. What would you say to women, let's say, who are maybe staunch feminists who are saying, you're a woman, you don't care about women if you're pro-life? What is your response to that?
Oh my goodness. I've actually had personal conversations at the UN with feminists who have said those very words to me. And at the end of the day, I always approach those conversations with a lot of compassion and love. And I would say to those women, why push for an agenda that says that your biology means nothing and that essentially wants you to fight your own biology? That at the end of the day is so antithetical to all that I believe in being a woman, is to say that my biology means nothing more, that I could strip away a life that has been gifted to me or to you and rid it of entire society. So there's many things I would say to a feminist, but I would necessarily don't say a whole lot at the end of the day, because I choose to listen first and foremost, because there's always a reason why people believe what they believe. And when you seek to hear the heart of the individual, I'll give you this example. I was at the UN and I was talking with a woman from Planned Parenthood, and it was a very human conversation, which is not normal in the political sphere, nor is it normal at the UN. It's all policy and trying to push for what you believe in. And I ended up talking to this woman, and I just stood there and listened and asked her, like, do you have family in New York? What do you do for a living? And then we finally got to the conversation of, why are you here? Who are you representing? And she said, I'm here from the UN, from the New York branch of Planned Parenthood. And as we were talking, I asked her, like, why do you support Planned Parenthood? What's your purpose? What's your reason? What's your rationale? And she came on to tell me that she actually had an abortion. She was forced into an abortion. And when I didn't say a word, it was just bizarre, because she just started telling me her whole life story. And she was a staunch feminist. And as I started to interact more and more with the conversation, she had never been presented with a pro-life woman who actually cared about her story. And I said, I'm so sorry that you were forced into an abortion and that your child's life was lost. My mother went through the same scenario. And so I can deeply relate with this and the pain and the scars that leaves. And she just broke down crying. And so I would say actively listen to any feminist that you come across, and show compassion and care, because you don't know what their story is. And that's, at the end of the day, this woman and I left that conversation and we both hugged each other. Like, it was the most human experience that I've ever had in that sphere. So that's what I would say to a feminist, and how I would choose to interact with a feminist as well.
Yeah, that's a great answer and great advice, and an encouraging story. So yeah, that's all my questions for you, Mattea. Thank you very much for answering them all, and thank you for being with me on Uplift, and for the impressive work that you're doing building a culture of life as well in America. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you soon, and thanks again for joining the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining me today on Uplift. Tune in again next week where we'll have more influential guests coming your way. If you are enjoying our content, please like, share and subscribe to our channel.